Most people who suffer some sort of abuse actually overcorrect in the opposite direction. They're actually super gentle. They're super sensitive. They're super kind. They often are actually too agreeable. If I could upgrade the myth's language, it's, maybe hurt people who have not processed their hurt and don't have good regulation skills might hurt other people. It's just an uncomfortable truth to get related to, that sometimes people hurt other people intentionally. I don't believe that we're all good or bad. I think we're a mix of both. And it's okay to be honest about that.
Right now, you can get self-help in your news, social media, and whatever artificial intelligence app you use or will use. But my guest today says a lot of it can hurt your mental health more than help it. Joe Nucci is a psychotherapist, the creator of the viral Instagram account @JoeNucciTherapy, and author of Psychobabble. And in this conversation, we're diving into the way people misuse therapy speak all over the place, a lot of the bad advice that's gone mainstream, and real stories about how it's actually hurt people. We had a lot of fun in this show, and after listening to it, you're going to get a better sense of how to spot it and really what to focus on that's going to help you delineate what's real and what's not real, what can work and what's not going to work. Some of my favorite topics in here were around gaslighting, narcissism, and where AI is going with it all. I'm happy you're here. This is going to be good. Hey, Joe Nucci, welcome to the Emotional Longevity Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's really good to be with you. Yeah. So I want to jump right into this because I think what you're doing is incredibly interesting. Obviously, I've been on the internet for a long time and have seen a lot of what you call psychobabble, out there. Yeah. And what was the moment you realized for yourself that not everything being shared on the internet, maybe, or on social media, is actually helping people when it comes to these mental health myths? Was it something in your life? Was it a patient? What was it?
Well, I think for me, it's two things. It's one, I started making content, let's say like maybe a year or two after grad school. So I did, all of my master's training, all my clinical training, like internship, post-grad hours and all this stuff. And when I started looking at what other creators were putting out there in terms of their content, it kind of reminded me as kind of like a first semester, first quarter in grad school, where it's like, I'm very like excited about all of these terms and I like want to use them and I want to tell people about this personality framework or that. And to be clear, I started doubling down and speaking out against the psychobabble, if you will, as it's the name of my book, all this misuse of psychological jargon, not because, I'm kind of this like ivory tower, like wagging my finger, like that's not the correct operational definition, sir. But it was actually because as I got more experience as a therapist, I learned that, well, actually, if you misuse these terms or misunderstand these constructs or frameworks or whatever it might be, it actually has real consequences for your mental health, for your patient's mental health. And so it's less like it's not that I'm like, if I'm at a party and somebody talks about, gaslighting and they use it for humor or exaggeration or an incorrect way. That's not what's bothering me. What's bothering me is if people start to use these terms and they make decisions about their mental health or about their therapy, or they're using social media to get their healthcare information. I think a study recently came out that shows like at least like half of all people are doing so. It's probably larger. The number is probably larger the younger you are. And so for me, it was just, I was out of a concern that people were taking things as true, but really they were just kind of sound bites or memes. And it felt, it felt worth speaking out about.
Yeah. What, speaking of like the harm it might cause people that they're not aware of, because this is the world we live in, is a world of sound bites right now.
Yeah.
And,
right.
What harm were you seeing or anticipating happening when people used it, when they're using social media for their emotional health?
Yeah, well, I mean, oh my gosh, there's so many to pick from. The few that come to mind is people using And I write about this in a later chapter in the book, people using attachment styles to explain early dating behavior, which is just not what attachment styles were formulated to describe or understand. And I think there's actually a meaningful difference between being avoidantly attached to somebody and avoiding intimacy because you're engaging in what like a psychologist might call intimacy blocking behaviors. Like this person doesn't want to pursue intimacy with you, and that feels awful when you like someone and they don't reciprocate that interest. And so I understand the appeal to want to maybe understand. It's like, oh, well, this is like, like it's their avoidant attachment, like they actually like me. And I understand why that's wonderfully like appealing in terms of content or a belief to kind of soothe the emotional pain or the uncomfortability that rejection will afford all of us. We all get rejected. It doesn't matter what you look like or who you are. But I also think it's important that you know that this is not a cogent or accurate analysis if you've only been on 2 dates with this person, right? Or we brought up gaslighting earlier. Gaslighting is not disagreeing. I see it in my practice with my couples. I notice it socially, and of course it's online, where people say, well, don't gaslight me. And what they're saying is don't disagree with me. And it's like, well, I hate to tell you this, but the promise of mental health and couples therapy is actually to be able to handle disagreement with resilience. And if the memory researchers can agree on one thing, it's that all of our memories are super unreliable. And so if someone's remembering something differently from you, even if they are objectively wrong, it's just not evidence of gaslighting. I mean, gaslighting is really horrible psychological abuse. I talk about a patient vignette in the book where, this was a survivor of very real gaslighting, and they couldn't trust themselves to trust their basic perceptions of reality. They were so fragile, and it was such a long and difficult process. And I think that if people understood that or heard those stories, they wouldn't necessarily be using those terms because they would realize they're being they're exaggerating, to say the very least. And I think at worst, it's just inappropriate.
Yeah, it might be a way to avoid our own discomfort, like you were saying with the rejection. Yeah. I don't have to deal with this if I can just kind of label it and name it on something else.
Totally.
The psychobabble, just to use the term you're using, it sounds, there's something appealing about it. It sounds really true when you see it. We get kind of, I even see like my teenage kids also who have social media now, and they sometimes show me some stuff, and I'm like, oh, okay, hey, that's not true. That's, they gotta kind of fact check some of it, but it sounds so true, which I think is why we fall for it a lot. And why do you think that we've become so susceptible, or maybe we've always been this way, to like an oversimplified or feel good type of like psychology that we can fall into?
Well, I've thought a lot about this, and here's the latest version of this answer. I'd love to know if you have any upgrades, because it seems like the psychobabble really rears its ugly head in the following discrete areas: dating and relationships, family, and then like at work, or like anything that's kind of like success or financial oriented. And I think in all 3 of these domains, these are areas of life where we would like to have more control than we have. That's the hard and honest truth. We don't have as much control as we'd like to have over our family members or what family we're born into. Certainly, most of us would like more control over our dating life, or, how our relationship's going with our partner. And of course, most of us spend most of our times working, or pursuing our career, or just trying to make ends meet. And so stuff at work will come up as well. And I think that there's this appeal that psychology has this. Psychology apparently knows something the rest of us don't know about people and about emotions and about these 3 different things. And so I think it's a way to feel a little bit more in control. And that is not to say that there aren't any useful insights from the field. I think the field is full of use. Like, I'm a psychology nerd, like as are you, I'm sure. And so it's not even that it's not worth, thinking about it through this lens, but I think where it becomes very, very dangerous is where we think we can then look into our crystal ball and kind of speak these psychobabble terms or learn a couple of constructs. And then we actually have so much more control than we actually have. I actually think the more adaptive way to go about it is to get as much control as you can, usually over yourself, right? And then kind of proceed the best you can with the cards that you've been dealt. But that's not what's often sold on social media. it's usually the opposite, I think.
I think all of that is true. We're wired to conserve energy. And so if something's a shortcut for us and somebody gives us like a
Totally.
quick tip or a statistic or hey, just frame it like this with the other person, that's a way of kind of conserving energy. We're also wired to move away from the fire and not step into it. Typically, by the way. and so if we can again like avoid an aversive or uncomfortable feeling,
Right.
then by someone saying it's about another person, or if this person's acting like this, they're probably this. By the way,
Yeah.
like on social media in particular, I think there's different domains that historically people have followed. It's love. That's the relationship domain. It's wealth and work, and there's health.
Mm.
And you see some of the change leaders out there. They have programs in all those different things because these are the basic things that we go for. So all of those
Mm.
different elements that you named seem to fall into those categories
Yeah.
too. And so we're kind of hitting on them. But I do think,
Sure.
yeah, safety, security, sense of internal control. It's not my fault. Yeah, these are all.
Yeah. Once a very social media savvy person said to me, "What do you think about this?" They said that they felt like there's kind of 7 pillars of virality and they all play on the 7 deadly sins. And so, because if you look at like even something like, food Instagram, like restaurants or chefs, it's kind of like this food. I mean, it looks better than real food. You know what I mean? And there's so that's gluttony. And then of course, like lust with like thirst traps or any sort of like sexual or sensual, or just beautiful people, maybe showing off their bodies or whatever it might be. I think that when it comes to the mental health side of things, my suspicion is that it's maybe playing on this like idea of like pride, where it's just kind of like, well, if you learn this framework, you understand this, you're more knowledgeable, you're more self-aware than other people. You actually understand them more than they do, and there's kind of this added superiority, maybe. I don't know.
I was just reflecting with someone. This is just kind of a personal story, but I can get personal here. When I was younger, I was a real thrill seeker. And I
Mm.
used to, I was the kid that stole things from the stores. I was the kid that would be going into the clubs to get the, illicit drugs for everyone else, and including myself. And the reason was, and I'm saying this because it piggybacks on a point you just made, was because I got attention from that. I got something from that. I received some kind of social acceptance from that. I got to be seen as the leader in some way, and so I got a little bit of power out of that. And so I
Mm.
think also, yeah, if you're the person who knows this psychobabble and you can like kind of spread it around, you might be seen as someone who's knowledgeable, or this, you know things,
Mhm.
facts and quips, and
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right about that.
Well, and for everyone listening too, it's something that I find that I've been talking about a lot as I've been talking more about the book, is that if first year psych students, I alluded to this earlier, we're the number one offenders of this. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, and it usually comes from not a place to, manipulate or to kind of seem like holier than thou. It's usually from excitement. And my suspicion is that's really what's happening, not just online, but culturally, because mental health has gotten destigmatized over the last several years. And there's been kind of this rise in popularization. There's been a substantive, what I refer to as like a mental health culture. I think a lot of it is just, it's like that, but we do have a responsibility, I think, as a mental health culture and community to make sure that people that are going to be spending their times talking about this, making content about it, particularly if you have a following, to bring it a click or two deeper so that it can actually like help people in a scalable way. One of my concerns is that it kind of just seems to be this, I sometimes think about like big therapy, like kind of like big business, where it's like, like a lot of people, myself included, make a ton of money from the attention that you're getting, and you can sell courses, or in this case, I'm selling a book or like whatever it is. And I think that's all fine. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I think that we just need to be thoughtful about our ethics as well and make sure that we're not, scaring people into buying our courses,
Uh-huh.
or fear mongering, or just putting stuff out there that I don't think is substantive enough to be responsible.
By the way, I'm just curious. What do you that for years? There's been a lot of, to me, psychobabble around the term narcissism and narcissist. It's had its waves over time, where just everyone would be labeling everyone as a narcissist,
Yeah.
especially in relationships. Oh, I was dating this guy. He was a narcissist. My parent was a narcissist, or
Right.
what's
Yeah.
your vibe on that?
Oh, I have so much to say. The first thing that I would say is that it it seems to me that if you're surrounded by them all the time and it's like every single person you've ever dated, there is a common denominator. And I think it's important to think about this concept of vulnerable narcissism, where it's like you're not the hoity-toity grandiose, like I'm better than everyone else, but it's like you're morally superior because you're the victim. I think that that's in our culture in more ways than one when it comes to the dating and self-help stuff. I mean, look, relationships are really, really tough. And I know that when I've gone through a breakup, I personally haven't been my best. My
Uh-huh.
exes have certainly not been their best
Mm-hmm.
either. And what's so funny about this myth that everyone's, ex is a narcissist, when I've talked about the book just socially amongst friends or at a party, people will ask for an example. And this is usually the one I lead with. And without fail, every single person does two things in this order. They first say, "You're right. It is so overused. It's ridiculous. It's harmful. It's affecting all sorts of things." But then they always kind of like to add on, "But my ex." And
Yeah, but my ex, yeah.
what's so funny about it is, but I also feel that way. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
But it's like I also like believe that one of my exes, who I will not name, like definitely like had something pathological going on, and
Uh-huh. He
maybe I'm
knows
right,
who
and
he is.
maybe
Right.
maybe these other people are right. But at the end of the day, like I think any of us who consider ourselves self-aware or growth oriented have to take a beat and just be like, are they narcissistic, or is actually getting a little grandiose a normal response to dealing with stress, especially the stress of a breakup? We can all think we're super well adjusted, and then our moms say one thing or our partner like triggers us in just the right way.
Yep. We get kicked into that emotional loop and we can spiral from there. You speaking about the relationship and breakup thing. I think I saw a reel that you did, where you're busting a myth of hurt people hurt people. Was that you
Mm,
that I saw it on there? Do you
yeah,
remember that? Um,
yeah.
and you said this is also a myth. Like, speak to that.
Yeah. So, what I talk about in the book on this chapter, because this is something that I've heard repeated all over the place, not just on social media. And I think that, obviously for some people, it is true. Their violence or their hurt is kind of externalized and acted out on others. But my experience as a therapist is that not just half, but my anecdotal experience is that most people who suffer some sort of abuse actually overcorrect in the opposite direction. They're actually super gentle. They're super sensitive. They're super kind. They often are actually too agreeable. I would say
Mm-hmm.
that often the work with them in therapy is helping them draw boundaries to stop, kind of quote unquote people pleasing or whatever it might be. And so for me, there's actually other factors going on here. If I could upgrade the myth's language, it's, maybe hurt people who have not processed their hurt and don't have good regulation skills might hurt other people. But there's also, I think it's just an uncomfortable truth to get related to that sometimes people hurt other people intentionally.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes, and maybe there's, something on like the psychopathy scale. Or sometimes it's just like, I don't know. I don't believe that we're all good or bad. I think we're a mix of both. And I think it's okay to be honest about that.
I might even say hurt people hurt themselves. Um,
Mm,
you know,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's that. And I think that there's also, it kind of gets convoluted when you start thinking about adding like mental health into it. So if I'm thinking about someone like on the bipolar spectrum, it's more common knowledge that in mania or hypomania, you're very happy and kind of elevated, but a lot of times it's actually like agitation. And a lot
Can
of
be. Yeah.
people that are right, and a lot of people that are doing this will lash out and hurt people in their life, and it can make the repair process after that like incredibly difficult. But it's if we're going to destigmatize mental health, if we're going to, move the needle in our culture, so people that are on the bipolar spectrum, there's some more awareness and acceptance around this. I'm not totally sure that this like myth is helping it just
Yeah.
starts to get too nuanced.
Yeah. I think in that particular situation, what comes up for me is somebody, is in a relationship with let's say someone who had not been yet taking care of themselves, who had bipolar disorder and
Mm-hmm.
was regularly dysregulated, maybe went into periods where they, even as far as attempting suicide, the person witnessing that, they just don't have it's hard to trust. And so now they have their own trauma within the relationship.
Mm,
And that's where the confusion happens, or it's challenging, because now it's in some ways, now it's implicit within
mm,
both people. And then there needs to be some form of relational healing that comes from that. But it speaks to the very basic of our own sense of security and safety. And that can
yeah.
happen in any relationship, whether a person's bipolar or not, or whatever.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah. The other thing I don't love about this myth is I don't love that there's kind of this implied moral value that will just never hurt, just like never hurt anyone. And I think that actually empowers the more vulnerably narcissistic types that I mentioned earlier, because when you move away from physical hurt into emotional hurt, it starts to become very, very subjective, right? And so then that's another reason why I don't like the saying very much, because when I was young, I was a very sensitive child, and I still am very sensitive. I would describe myself as sensitive, but I also have developed the range and capacity to be tough and to stand my ground, right? And to not let the emotions kind of like overpower me. And so what I might find hurtful in terms of like a joke or an offhand comment today is very, very different from, even like a few years ago, let alone like 10 years ago. Right. And so when people start to understand emotional hurt this way, I think that that's another way it becomes problematic, because I don't know if the solution is to recite the mantra, well, hurt people. And that's why this person said that. I think that you can also get curious on how you can show up differently too.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've spent a lot more time on this than the average person as far as like seeing this stuff. Most people are just kind of flipping through this advice and then clicking like and share and or whatever, right? And so I want to know if you have any advice, because you've been in this space, around how do you filter what's real and not real? Like how do
Ooh.
you counsel people to do that?
It's a great question. A few things come to mind. The first thing is to just know the basics of kind of research and scientific literature. And what I mean by that is that just because it is published doesn't necessarily make it true. But at least if it's published in a way where you can, look at the methodology, you can look at like the takeaways, if there are any, interest groups funding it, or whatever it might be, and just kind of understand, well, what does the science say? A lot of my work, both in the book and on social media, a lot of it was me looking up the formal kind of operationalized definitions of these terms and then just comparing it to how it's been used. Did that take some time? Did that take some effort? Absolutely. But it's also something that any single person can do who's listening to this, right? So I would say that's number one. I would say number two, when it comes to deciding whether or not like you should employ a psychological term or a therapy-based term into a conversation, what I do is I stop and ask myself, well, can I communicate this without this language?
Yeah.
And would that actually be more helpful? So is it more helpful to describe your ex as a narcissist, or is it more helpful to describe them as really selfish or immature? A lot of emotional immaturity looks just like narcissism, but it's meaningfully different. I prefer the immaturity framing just because that implies this idea that they can mature, they can grow, they can develop. I'm heavily influenced by the developmental kind of literature and thinking. And so I think for me, it's always kind of like, what's that saying? It's like, keep it simple, stupid. Like, it's kind of like, don't overcomplicate it. I think that psychobabble has given a lot of people this appealing way to overcomplicate it. And I think that sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess you could say, like, you can imagine yourself in that situation and you're using that psychobabble, and then the person says, "What do you mean?" And if you're not able to respond what you mean, then that's maybe an
Totally.
indication maybe
Yeah.
not to use it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What
Yeah.
do you What do you feel like are some of the red flags that you see when you're looking when you're looking through any form of media? Because I know I say social media quite a bit, but like media in
Yeah.
general is just like
Mm,
this. Um, what are some of the red flags that something's more about like clicks and selling soap and ads
mm.
versus actually caring about people?
Well, when it comes to the mental health space, the one thing that's coming up for me in this moment is sometimes I'll peep at another creator's like course that they're selling,
Uh
and
huh.
they're listing pretty much any and every symptom under the sun, and then attributing it to trauma, complex trauma, developmental trauma. This now, I do believe I like the CPTSD framework. Like I buy into it. I know it's not formally in like our DSMs and stuff like that, but it's I found it helpful in terms of understanding patients. But I know that for me, it's kind of there's always something a little bit suspicious when you're, for an example, if you're saying like oh, like, are you forgetful sometimes? It's like, well, as a licensed medical professional, you should know that forgetfulness can have all sorts of origins in etiologies. Yes, maybe there is dissociative amnesia happening like from trauma, but like, is your course, that costs $199, just swipe up? Like, is your course really like the right venue for this person? Like, have they checked in with their PCP? Like, do they have a TBI? Is it a nutritional deficiency? And like that
Uh
kind
huh.
of
Right.
bespoke work is what you're getting when you work with a competent shrink. And I find that when things are kind of over promising like that, or they're pulling at different stuff that the people might be struggling with, that I think they really do need to be holistically evaluated. That for me, that's where I start to get a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, I guess if it's something feel like with anything, if something feels too good to be true in some way, then there might be something there that's behind that. Would you? I know in another talk that we had, we talked about AI a little bit.
Yeah.
Would you ever plug something that someone says like into there and take and think that what it comes back with is going to give you a more comprehensive response as to whether this is psychobabble or not?
Oh, interesting. You could. I don't see why you couldn't use ChatGPT or whatever your AI of choice is to sort out the definition. I do know that when it comes to coaching and therapy, a lot of these bots are designed to be kind of sycophantic. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that you may want to explicitly instruct it to be a PhD in clinical psych or an expert in psychological terms or something like that, and be very clear that your desire is to understand the proper definition and usage so you could compare it to how it's being used. But I think you could. I personally haven't, but I think that it's possible.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
there's my experience with it, just as a side note, is that even if you give it that precursor of don't be sycophantic, just
Mhm.
I want the real balanced view of this. Is this true or not? It might remember it in the beginning, and then it'll kind of forget that
Right.
pretty soon.
Yeah.
My under and maybe this is a rumor. I'm not quite sure. So take it with a grain of salt. Everyone who's listening and watching, is that I think that the GPT-5 and probably other are trying to really kind of reduce that sycophantic response,
Hmm.
from my understanding. But who knows? But anyway, it's really important to
Yeah.
know that if you're trying to make sense of some of the psychobabble that you're hearing out there, because there's a cost to blindly following this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What have you seen in
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Well, first I want to mention, did you catch there was I think a New York Times podcast where they interviewed this woman who developed a very like intimate and sexual relationship with her chat GPT. Did you catch this?
I did not catch that one, but I feel like I've probably seen stuff like that
Yeah.
out there.
Well, for me, the most interesting part of the pod, I mean, there's so many interesting kind of psychological perspectives to take here, of course, but the most interesting part for me was why she fell out of love with it. And the reason she fell out of
Ah,
love with it was because the memory that you were describing, how it kind of can remember broad strokes, but that you have to kind of reprompt it. It was heartbreaking for her. She ended up having to grieve it. And for me, it was actually just kind of a cool reminder that often what we do for our loved ones is we remember the little things, the little details, and for a very long time. um and not just in dating, but even like in therapy, right? Like I do this for patients. I would say every single one of my patients, where they're talking about something and I go back through my notes and I'm like, well, 6 months ago, you actually said the opposite. You know what I mean? Like, and it's because you just feel like you're being paid so close attention to. And so it was just kind of it was an interesting insight that I thought had a lot of just application, not just for how we practice therapy, but also like how we love people, that I wasn't expecting to get from the from the podcast of the girl who fell in love with her chat GPT 4.
Yeah, I think that's a really sweet and astute insight. And I think that's why people initially fall in love with it, is because initially for the short term, it does remember things, and you're not getting that from you may not be getting that from friends or family or partner, ex-partner or something like that.
Right.
And like, wow, this thing really knows me. It really, but it's the memory just in the technology space, and we'll shift from here after that, is that's the biggest crux of AI, is that the memory is really ultimately going to be the issue at the moment, anyway, for today. Anyway, interesting side note. But
sure.
I mean, have you actually seen in your work and practice, like people, like a cost for following some of this psychological, let's say, advice that's not there? Like, have you seen it actually make people's lives worse?
Absolutely. In one of the chapters in the book, I talk about neurodivergency, and there is some literature exploring this, but it's a very popular belief on social media that people with ADHD and autism can have something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. And so the idea is that they're extra sensitive, more sensitive than a neurotypical person or the average person, to either real or perceived rejection. And then it causes them to become incredibly dysregulated. Now, I've heard kind of two explanations for this. One is that there's actually something that has to do with the neurodevelopmental condition that is autism or ADHD. But then the other is that because when you're younger, maybe it's before you get diagnosed, it's harder for you to make friends. And so you're already kind of primed to be sensitive to such rejection. In either case, I can think about more than one patient actually who has come to me already being aware of this term, really identifying it. And I am very proud to say, even though my experience is anecdotal, of course, that I have a 100% success rate in treating this, and that it usually has nothing to do at all with their ADHD or their autism. And it usually has to do with childhood or their past, and with the right interventions, whether it's kind of desensitization through exposure therapy, or whether it's emotionally focused therapy, or whatever it might be, they're able to tolerate real or perceived rejection in their relationships, in their dating life, and in their friendships. And they're able to be a healthier, more adaptive, more resilient individual because of it. I think that the tragedy that I see is so many people who are ADHD or who have ADHD or have autism will seek out incredibly, kind of neuro-affirming providers. And to any of those providers or those individuals who happen to be listening to this, in case you don't know this about me, I do have diagnosed ADHD. And it's one of the reasons why I feel, I think, maybe a little bit more permission to kind of stand up to that community online, because the circulating RSD, as they've termed it, as this core feature of your condition is not scientifically validated, and it actually robs you of the experience to perhaps transform. And I think that's the promise of our field, right? That you can be different, you could be better. You're not necessarily going to make an identity out of this. And so this is one example of many, but how unfortunate that there are the number of people out there who are not seeking help for their experience of feeling very sensitive to real or perceived rejection, because they believe it is just part of who they are and it's part of their neurodivergency, is not zero. And I wouldn't even say that it's very low. I think it's a lot of people.
Hey, taking a quick break to let you know, I've got a new book coming out called Tiny Shifts. It's about how small, intentional shifts in your emotional health can transform your stress, relationships, and even your longevity. When you join the early access list, you're going to get a free sneak peek of the Tiny Shifts mini guide and weekly insights into the top tools and trends in emotional health. Just head to drelyshagoldstein.com/tiny-shifts-early. If you can't remember that, the link is also in the show notes below. Now let's get back to the episode. And if you look at that, and I'll just say something about, just to piggyback on what you're saying, if you fall into that and believe that, then if we take a look at Carol Dweck's work at Stanford and her growth and fixed mindset, you fall into this fixed mindset. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
Obstacles are inevitable, but, whatever I try, if I fail, it just reaffirms, this identity. And then that's also correlated with higher anxiety and depression. And so, if we want to kind of be able to shift from that, what you're doing, the work that you just talked about, that you said I have 100% success rate with people, you're actually shifting them from a fixed to a growth mindset around this particular thing. So you improve their lives in the way that you're talking about, but that has ripple effects across the decades that follow for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It also makes me think of something I talk about in the book. I don't specifically refer to her work on the fixed and growth mindset, although I am familiar with it. But I talk a lot about just like the external versus internal locus of control.
Yep.
Where it's actually kind of, I'm actually just having this thought for the first time this moment, but it's kind of a weird way to kind of rob people of having either. Where like if I say, well, you are like this because of your diagnosis or because of your neurodivergency, and there's nothing you can do about it. I am on one hand saying that this is a problem that is in your nervous system that you cannot fix, right? And I'm not attributing it to an external or systemic problem, right? And I'm just kind of giving it to you, and that's so deeply disempowering. Because at least even if you're blaming other people, like you're at least acknowledging that like the circumstance can change, right? But what I think is so potentially dangerous about like the fixed mindset stuff is you're basically saying that, well, none of it's fixable. None of it is in anybody's control. This is just how it is. And that, as you know, is correlated with poor mental health outcomes across the board.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And just, the basic thing of just reinforcing and like just falling short in some way is a reinforcement of an identity. That is just kind of like, it's a hard, you could see why it leads to this poor mental health outcomes. You could see why it would like make someone feel depressed. Oh yeah, there I am again. I'm just kind of helpless. You're the external locus of control. It's just outside of my control here. It's, I got nothing, I got nothing here.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Are you familiar
It's
with
hard.
Dr. Alan Francis and his work?
No, I don't think so.
He
Tell
wrote
us.
this book, Saving Normal. He published it in like 2012 or 2013. He was at the American Psychiatric Association. He's edited parts of it, and his book Saving Normal was basically, it really is informed my own personal philosophy, and I would argue even one of the main themes of my book, Psychobabble, this idea of don't pathologize everyday existence. One of his quotes in there, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, is something like, if it's a mental illness, if it's a mental disorder, it is not going to get better on its own. It is not going to get better with time. Like, it needs intervention, right? And it needs intervention early, or the symptoms are going to get worse. And, the treatment will take longer and it will be harder. But if it's a problem of living, time and, just support from loved ones will take care of it. And something that I've thought about as I was writing the book was just thinking about how it's kind of weird to be living in this paradigm where it's like, well, the way you receive support, emotional support for your anxiety and depression, not your nervousness or sadness, right, is to go to a professional or to like be knowledgeable of these frameworks. When I would say that, we're all going to feel sad, we're all going to feel apathetic, we're all going to be very nervous or self-conscious, whatever it might be. And one of the best things that we can do is just kind of be there for each other and love each other. But it's kind of this weird, like almost kind of like capitalistic thing. Like, I don't know if that's quite the right analysis, where it's like, well, you have to go pay this person once a week to experience this. And you can't experience this with other people who haven't gone to have it. It's just kind of like, are we sure about that? Because let me tell you, I'm thinking of this dude I once dated who had never been to therapy, and he needed to. Let me just say that. But he was an absolute master at intuitively understanding when we needed to like talk about it and when we needed to just go do something fun. And take our minds off it. And it's one of the things I've taken from that relationship myself, because of course, sometimes we need to talk about it. But then other times it was just a very simple, like, oh, that sucks. I'm so sorry. Like, let's go get a drink. Like, let's go for a walk. Like, let's, like he had that very kind of like go-getter personality. And I've taken that wisdom not just into my own relationships, but like with my patients. Like sometimes we got to process it, sometimes we got to talk about it in exquisite detail. And other times, right, maybe we laugh it off. Right?
Yeah.
And there's no formula for it. You have to just kind of practice and learn how to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't need the analysis. I remember John Gottman, and to speak about and then it became a whole field of discussion and research. But I remember when John Gottman out of Seattle, and for those of you who are not familiar with him and his wife, they've made their whole career out of relationships. And I remember one time he was speaking. He's like, sometimes your partner gets home and you blow up into this fight over the remote control or something like that. And really what it was you were just in two different places. This person came and they had a really hard day at work. You'd had this other, a stressful situation, and just your nervous systems were in different spots, and it just kind of combusted. It really wasn't even about the topic at all. So really in that case, you just needed to go do something fun together and
totally
connect.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we can get stuck in these like negative feedback loops that will just absolutely like demolish your mental health. So for those who are listening, a basic example of this is if you drink and you're hungover and you're feeling anxious because you're hungover, you want the anxiety to go away, so you drink some more. Right.
Yeah.
That is a one-way ticket to developing a substance use disorder. Similarly, if you're avoiding something because it makes you anxious, and so you don't confront it and don't deal with it. Right. And so, but it's kind of tragic to get present to how I think a lot of this psychobabble, I think reinforces a lot of these loops, if we're being honest with ourselves. And in the consumer's defense, like the consumer of therapy, like the patient or the consumer of the content, I think a lot of therapists create these loops just more out of like poor training and low levels of competency. I don't think they're necessarily like malicious, although some of them could be. I think it's more of like an Occam's razor, like don't assume malicious intent. Because it's hard, right? Like it's hard. Like when my patient like has to confront something, like they don't like it when I like prompt them to confront it. It doesn't feel warm and fuzzy.
Yeah. I mean, that's that riding that edge of the window of tolerance right there.
Yeah.
We're just trying to, I have a question for you. So, I know you and I kind of share, we do share an interest in AI related stuff. And right now, speaking of psychobabble, AI is, it can pump out self-help content faster than ever, and more of it than you're even seeing in the media. Do you see our use of it right now and people using it for that reason as making it worse or better?
It's tough because I guess it depends on what the different models are trained on. And there's so much psychobabble, and take the psychobabble out of it. Our field is just so new.
Sure.
Like we thought that autism was caused by like emotionally distant mothers, like just a few decades ago. Like, you know what I mean? Like it was like weird stuff. And so I'm sure that, in our lifetimes, we will be humbled by some stuff that we think is super self-evident today. So I think that that's the first thing that comes up for me is like, oh, is it being trained on the right data? Because I know that when I have a lot of trouble using artificial intelligence to understand political dynamics. It's really great with like philosophy or rhetoric, but when you try to use it to kind of do research across different news outlets and stuff, it can only read what's there. It can't verify the spin or the accuracy, right, of any of these statements. And so similarly, I kind of worry about that. I personally think that it's going to replace at least half of what we do as clinicians. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that I would rather have a really excellent robot do therapy for something like OCD, than a poorly
just
trained
like step by step
clinician.
Things that
well, totally. Well, because I am not like I can do very like mild to moderate manifestations of OCD, but I know enough to know that that's actually not a competency of mine, and I just know that how bad it can be like if you don't do it properly, and so I think like stuff like that I think could be very interesting. I'm sorry, what was your question?
I guess you know what what that brings up for me actually is that there's plenty of therapists, and this is good for everyone to know who has been or has not been to therapy, that who will take you, and you might have a condition. They're not the specialist in it.
Right.
And so it is very important if you have a specific issue to be able to seek. I know connection at the end of the day seems to be the most important factor in the relationship in therapy. But if you have a specific issue, it's really good to check in with a specialist in that area who's going to just be a little bit more versed and studied in that, like OCD as an example. The question was about AI. So my experience has been like, I could see it actually being kind of overwhelming, because if someone's using it for kind of self-help type of therapeutic stuff at the moment, because it can give you a lot of different advice, a lot of different practices, a lot of different, things like that. So I could see to some degree it being overwhelming, where I found it actually to be helpful even personally in my own life, because I have my own therapy. I have, I do that. And so is using it sometimes in between the sessions to follow what you've already done in the session to get it a little bit deeper. Now, I would say probably the apps that are coming out, and this is all like grain of salt, trial and error for everyone right now, because it's also new. I mean, if the field of therapy is so new, certainly the field of like AI integration with therapy is like obviously. So you're going to take it, you're going to have the kind of waiver going into it. But it's interesting because it could help deepen things that you've done in the session.
Totally. I personally have not used it yet in terms of my own practice. I will say that I have used it, not how you're describing in terms of like talking about the case, but I've used it with a couple of my patients who already use it and they talk about using it. Like we'll share our screen and like go and like kind of talk to it, and then kind of just then we'll dialogue about like what we think about it. And it usually has been depending on what we use it for, it can actually be very helpful. I'm thinking of one case specifically. There was some disordered eating going on, and they were, take the mental health stuff out of it for a second. Like they were just not understanding like basic principles of biology. And so we ended up talking to chat about it. And I actually think it was very helpful because they were very, they had this belief where they needed to be scared of carbohydrates to achieve their aesthetic goals. Yeah. And for anyone who is a serious, lifter or bodybuilder knows that is actually just not true. Like that is just like point blank, like not true for anyone that is like, very active or looking to like build muscle. And so it was actually very great. I remember for chat to just very like succinctly kind of be like, oh yeah, like, well, this is like why you likely believe this. And, this is where this is like the little kernel of truth and like, like a low carb diet comes from, but this is why it's not aligned with your long-term goal. And it was actually really great because I think sometimes it's a deeper kind of process problem. Right. But then other times it's like they just don't know, like no one told them, And so I thought that was really interesting, the way it showed up.
That's why I think doing it. I like how you do it. I mean, see, when I'm hearing you speak right now, I'm like, my God, yeah, Joe. It's an example of how we're starting to kind of use it and formulate it. I mean, it's caveman period time right now, but it's totally you're like just kind of like using it, figuring it out, and eventually it'll have standards and it'll have, hey, this is how we use it and in the field, and maybe it'll replace a number of therapists, but maybe it'll be an integration hybrid type thing. I think it's called augmented AI therapy now. There's actually like even a term for it.
I think it's interesting. I think what's going to be kind of interesting about it is people who start using it for that kind of support when they're younger, for them to be able to like have it for years and years and years. And to your point, there's like that memory, like technical function issue. But if they could solve for that, I would argue that that's better psychoanalysis, than maybe even a person.
Well, a person, one of the things that I am surprised even about myself sometimes is my context dependent memory in sessions with people, because in my everyday life, I might not even have that same kind of memory, but context dependent in sessions, but still something that can remember all the way every moment from child. That's going to be more advanced and upgrade And that's why I think using it in conjunction with a human will ultimately, depending on what someone's needs are. So, for example, and I'll just say this one thing and we'll leave it there. Where companies are going now with this is they're using it to build it as a triage. Who's subclinical?
Mm.
Who's clinical? Who needs more advanced care? So the AI will help triage that. Then they'll
Oh.
say you need to be with a human, or you can just do that. You can just be with the AI because you're subclinical.
Oh.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
yeah.
I like
So
that a lot.
question for you, because I'm aware of your time and I want to respect that. And if you could, speaking about psychobabble, like if you could whisper something in somebody's ear right now, or some kind of piece of advice as they're kind of going through their day, what would you say in relationship to this topic?
In relationship to psychobabble, well, I think that if the person is being plagued by psychobabble, like maybe they have a boss at work or a boyfriend or girlfriend or a friend that leverages these terms, um, I would want them to be aware of this idea of appeal to authority. It's a logical fallacy. So, you mentioned how we're built to conserve energy, and I think it's a wonderful thing to remember, because when we conserve energy, our mind will want to develop kind of simple schemas or frameworks in order to be more energy efficient. And sometimes there's little quirks in our logic, these little like fallacies, these little thinking errors, if you will. And I think that a lot of times when people are using this as a way to coerce people or to put pressure on people or to advance a certain agenda, just be thoughtful, where it's like, well, are they saying anything with any authority, or are they appealing to the authority that psychology has, right, to kind of make their argument? Just to ground it in an example, because I know that can sound kind of abstract. There is a big difference between someone who is using a term like gaslighting, for example, to shut down a negotiation or a conflict or a conversation, kind of using it as an appeal to authority. Well, it's like, well, you're basically abusive. I don't have to talk to you, right? There's a big difference between that and someone using the term as a way to deepen their understanding of what's going on. And because the main difference between problems of living and what we might call mental illnesses or mental disorders is usually about pervasiveness and severity and like frequency, like of the symptom or whatever the dynamic is. Um, if someone is going to use the situation to describe, if someone's going to use the term gaslighting to describe a situation, then decidedly they are probably only using it as a way to then move the conversation into, and how do I get out of this relationship? Or whatever it might be. Like they will walk the walk. They won't just talk the talk, to put it quite simply. And I think a lot of people use psychobabble to talk the talk, to avoid, to feel smarter than, to label, or appropriately or inappropriately. But that doesn't mean that they're walking the walk. Because something I write about, I think it's the last chapter in the book, is it's a little bit like learning to play an instrument or like learning a new language. When you're first learning Spanish, like you have to say, yo hablo español. I speak. But then as you get a little more advanced, you can say hablo español, because in Spanish, you don't need to say I. It's implied in how the verb is sounded out and articulated. Same thing with psychology terms. I think at the beginning, constrict yourself to the formal definitions. But as you get older, you don't even have to use them, right? Like when I treat
Yeah,
gaslighting
right.
in my patients, I'm not necessarily droning on and on about gaslighting. I'm actually doing therapy. I'm helping them build up a healthy self-esteem, et cetera. So yeah, anyone who's listening, I would say if it's getting plagued, or if it's plaguing you, just think about whether or not they're doing it for just to win, right, and not
Yeah.
to understand.
Yeah. I think one thing I appreciate about you, Joe, is your ability to take these terms and really weave them into everyday life. Like talk about them just like they're, like we could talk about them like their everyday life. And that means you really understand them. and where they're used and misused. And that's a very important, those are very important concepts to put out there. And so thank you for doing that. And I hope everyone kind of picks up a copy of Psychobabble. And I know it's behind you over there for those that are watching the actual video. And so tell us a little bit as we close, just where people can find that, where people can find you, what you're doing.
Yeah, well, it comes out on September 23rd, 2025. It is available for pre-order. You can find that on my website at joenuccitherapy.com, really anywhere you buy books, from Amazon to Barnes and Noble. And if you're on socials, at Joe Nucci Therapy has all the relevant links and info as well.
Yeah, and I can attest, he puts out some really great content and reels that's not psychobabble, and so but about it anyway, and you can get more informed by then. Probably actually that question that I ask is that I asked earlier, which is or I don't know, I think I wanted to ask anyway, which was how can people cut through the noise around it? Maybe kind of going to your social feeds is a way of kind of doing that.
Yeah. They could totally come to my page. There are also just lots of creators and lots of people putting out content that I don't necessarily classify as psychobabble. And I think that for me, just remember, like any other subject, if you're going to stay at the surface level, you're only going to be making surface level analysis, or you're only going to be able to apply it to surface level topics. If you want to, responsibly and accurately apply it to politics or a kind of a sociological phenomenon or your family or whatever it might be, get curious and learn a couple of clicks deeper. You don't have to necessarily go to grad school, but that's the same thing as any other subject, right? If we're talking about medicine or philosophy or law or whatever it might be, I think it's like anything else. The main difference is that those subjects weren't as stigmatized like mental health was 5-10 years ago. And so we just got to all adjust a little bit. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Be human, be a person.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. This is really great. Look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yes, please. Thank you again.
Hey, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Emotional Longevity Podcast. I hope you found it as inspiring and thought-provoking as I did. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to hit like down below, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone you know who could benefit from these insights. Your support helps us grow this incredible community and reach more people who need it. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to go deeper, if you're ready to truly integrate these ideas into your life, I'd love to invite you to join me in a beautiful, supportive community that's doing this transformative work together. It's a space where you'll find guidance, connection, and the tools you need to create lasting emotional health and resilience. Check out the links in the description below to learn more. And before you go, make sure to tune into our next episode. It's one that you won't want to miss. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, emotional health isn't about just feeling good. It's about building the foundation for a longer, healthier, and more joyful life. I'll see you soon.